Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. This week we're starting in on Around the World in 80 Days. It shouldn't take us nearly as long as Phantom took us. Phantom was much longer than the usual fare that I've gotten up to with this. So let's just hop right into it with Chapter 1. Oh, wow, that chapter title is rather long-winded. We'll just skip to the opening. Mr. Phileas Fogg lived in 1872 at number 7 Savile Row, Burlington Gardens, the house in which Sheridan died in 1814. He was one of the most noticeable members of the Reform Club, though he seemed always to avoid attracting attention. An enigmatical personage about whom was little known, except that he was a polished man of the world. People said that he resembled Byron, or at least that his head was Byronic, but he was a bearded, tranquil Byron who might live on 1,000 years without growing old. Certainly an Englishman, it was more doubtful whether Phileas Fogg was a Londoner. He was never seen on 'Change, nor at the bank, nor in the counting rooms of the city. No ships ever came into the London docks of which he was the owner. He had no public employment. He'd never been entered at any of the inns of the court, either the Temple, Lincoln's Inn, or the Gray's Inn, and nor had his voice ever resounded in the Court of Chancery, nor in the Executure, nor the Queen's Bench, or the ecclesiastical courts. He was certainly not a manufacturer, nor was he a merchant, nor a gentleman farmer. His name was strange to the scientific and learned societies, and he was never known to take part in the sage deliberations of the Royal Institution or the London Institution, the Artisans' Association, or the Institution of Arts and Sciences. He belonged, in fact, to none of the numerous societies which swarm in the English capital, from the Harmonic to that of the Entomologists, founded mainly for the purpose of abolishing pernicious insects. Phileas Fogg was a member of the Reform, and that was all. The way in which he got admission to this exclusive club was simple enough. He was recommended by the Barings, with whom he had an open credit. His checks were regularly paid at sight from his account current, which was always flush. Was Phileas Fogg rich? Undoubtedly. But those who knew him best couldn't imagine how he had made his fortune, and Mr. Fogg was the last person to whom to apply for the information. He wasn't lavish, nor, on the contrary, avaricious, for whenever he knew that money was needed for a noble, useful, or benevolent purpose, he supplied it quietly and often anonymously. He was, in short, the least communicative of men. He talked very little, and seemed all the more mysterious for his taciturn manner. His daily habits were quite open to observation, but whatever he did was so exactly the same thing he'd always done before that the wits of the curious were fairly puzzled. Had he travelled? Well, it was likely. No one seemed to know the world more familiarly. There was no spot so secluded that he didn't appear to have an intimate acquaintance with it. He often corrected, with a few clear words, the thousand conjectures advanced by members of the club as to lost and unheard of travellers, pointing out the true probabilities, and seeming as if gifted with a sort of second sight, so often did events justify his predictions. He must have travelled everywhere, at least in the spirit. It was at least certain that Phileas Fogg had not absented himself from London for many years. Those who were honoured by a better acquaintance with him than the rest declared that nobody could pretend to have ever seen him anywhere else. His sole pastimes were reading the papers and playing whist. He often won at this game, which, as a silent one, harmonized with his nature, but the winnings never went into his purse, being reserved as a fund for his charities. Mr. Fogg played not to win, but for the sake of playing. The game was in his eyes a contest, a struggle with a difficulty, yet a motionless, unwearying struggle, congenial to his tastes. Phileas Fogg was not known to have either wife nor children, which may happen to the most honest people, either relatives or near friends, which is certainly more unusual. He lived alone in his house in Savile Row, whither none penetrated. The game... No, that's not where I was. My apologies. A single domestic sufficed to serve him. He breakfasted and dined at the club, at hours mathematically fixed, in the same room, at the same table, never taking his meals with the other members, much less bringing a guest with him, and went home at exactly midnight, only to retire at once to bed. He never used the cosy chambers which the Reform provides for its favoured members. He passed 10 hours out of the 24 in Savile Row, either in sleeping or making his toilet. When he chose to take a walk, it was with a regular step in the entrance hall with its mosaic flooring, or in the circular gallery with its dome supported by 20 red porphyry. Porphyry? That's quite the word. I can't believe I said that on the first try. Let's see how we're supposed to say it, shall we? Porphyra. A hard, ingenious rock containing crystals, usually of feldspar, and a fine grain, typically reddish ground mass. So, porphyra. Wait, no, the schwa's in the middle. Porphyra. Yeah, I did say it right. Oh. Now, where was I? Or in the circular gallery with its dome supported by 20 red porphyra ionic columns. Yum, 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 yum. I did it better the first time. 20 red porphyra ionic columns, and illumined by blue-painted windows. When he breakfasted or dined, all the resources of the club, its kitchens and pantries, its buttery and dairy, aided to crowd his table with their most succulent stores. He was served by the gravest waiters in dress coats and shoes with swan-skin soles, who proffered the viands in special porcelain and on the finest linen. Club decanters of a lost mold contained his sherry, his port, and his cinnamon spice claret, while his beverages were refreshingly cooled with ice, bought at great cost from the American lakes. If to live in this style is to be eccentric, it must be confessed that there is something good in eccentricity. The mansion in Savile Row, though not sumptuous, was exceedingly comfortable. The habits of its occupant were such as to demand but little from the sole domestic, but Phileas Fogg required him to be almost superhumanly prompt and regular. On this very 2nd of October he had dismissed James Forster, because that luckless youth had brought him shaving water at 84 degrees Fahrenheit instead of 86, and he was awaiting his successor, who was due at the house between 11 and half past. Phileas Fogg was seated squarely on his armchair, his feet close together like those of a grenadier on parade, his hands resting on his knees, his body straight, his head erect. He was steadily watching a complicated clock which indicated the hours, the minutes, the seconds, the days, the months, and the years. At exactly 11:30, Mr. Fogg would, according to his daily habit, quit Savile Row and repair to the Reform. A rap at this moment sounded on the door of the cosy apartment where Phileas Fogg was seated, and James Forster, the dismissed servant, appeared. The new servant," said he, and a young man of 30 advanced and bows. "You're a Frenchman, I believe, and your name is John?" asked Phileas Fogg. "Jean, if monsieur pleases," replied the newcomer. "Jean Passepartout, a surname which has clung to me because I have a natural aptness for going out of one business into another. I believe I'm honest, monsieur, but to be outspoken, I've had several trade. I've been an itinerant circus rider, when I used to vault like Leotard and dance on a rope like Blondin. And then I got to be a professor of gymnastics, and as to make better use of my talents. And then I was a sergeant fireman at Paris, and assisted at many a big fire. But I quitted France 5 years ago, and wishing to taste the sweets of domestic life, took service as a valet here in England. Finding myself out of place, and hearing that Monsieur Phileas Fogg was the most exact and settled gentleman in the United Kingdom, I have come to Monsieur in the hope of serving with him a tranquil life, and forgetting even the name of Passepartout." "Passepartout suits me. You are well recommended to me. I hear a good report of you. You know my conditions?" responded Mr. Fogg. "Yes, monsieur." "Good. What time is it?" 22 minutes after 11, returned Passepartout, drawing an enormous silver watch from the depths of his pocket. "You are too slow." "Pardon me, monsieur, it's impossible. You are 4 minutes too slow. No matter, it's enough to mention the error. And now from this moment, 29 minutes after 11 a.m., this Wednesday, 2nd October, you are in my service." Phileas Fogg got up, took his hat in his left hand, and put it on his head with an automatic motion, and went off without a word. Passepartout heard the street door shut once. It was his new master going out. He heard it shut again. It was his predecessor, James Forster, departing in his turn. Passepartout remained alone in the house in Savile Row. Chapter 2, in which Passepartout is convinced that he has at last found his ideal. "Faith," muttered Passepartout, somewhat flurried, "I've seen people at Madame Tussaud's as lively as my new master." Madame Tussaud's people, let it be said, are of wax, and are much visited in London. Speech is all that is wanting to make them human. During his brief interview with Mr. Fogg, Passepartout had been carefully observing him. He appeared to be a man of about 40 years of age, with fine, handsome features, and a tall, well-shaped figure. His hair and whiskers were light, his forehead compact and unwrinkled, his face rather pale, his teeth magnificent. His countenance possessed in the highest degree what physiognomists call repose in action, a quality of those who act rather than talk. Calm and phlegmatic, with a clear eye, Mr. Fogg seemed a perfect type of that English composure which Angelica Kauffmann had so skilfully represented on canvas. Seen in the various phases of his daily life, he gave the idea of being perfectly well balanced, as exactly regulated as a Leroy chronometer. Phileas Fogg was indeed exactitude personified, and this was betrayed even in the expression of his very hands and feet, for in men as well as in animals, the limbs themselves are expressive of passions. He was so exact that he was never in a hurry, always ready, and was economical alike of his steps and his motions. He never took one step too many, and always went to his destination by the shortest cut. He made no superfluous gestures, and was never seen to be moved or agitated. He was the most deliberate person in the world, and yet always reached his destination at the exact moment. He lived alone, and, so to speak, outside of every social relation. And as he knew in this world account must be taken of friction, and that friction, slows you, he must never be rubbed against anyone. As for Passepartout, he was a true Parisian of Paris. Since he had abandoned his own country in search for England, taking service as a valet, he had in vain searched for a master after his own heart. Passepartout was by no means one of those pert dunces depicted by Molière with a bold gaze and a nose held high in the air. He was an honest fellow, with a pleasant face, lips a trifle protruding, soft-mannered and serviceable, with a good round head, such as one likes to see on the shoulders of a friend. His eyes were blue, his complexion rubicund, his figure almost portly, definitely well built, his body muscular, and his physical powers fully developed by the exercises of his younger days. His brown hair was somewhat tumbled, for while the ancient sculptors are said to have known 18 methods of arranging Minerva's tresses, Passepartout was familiar with but one of dressing his own. 3 strokes of a large-toothed comb completed his toilet. It'd be rash to predict how Passepartout's lively nature would agree with Mr. Fogg. It was impossible to tell whether the new servant would turn out as absolutely methodical as his master required. Experience alone could solve the question. Passepartout had been a sort of vagrant in his early years, and now yearned for repose, but so far he had failed to find it, though he had already served in 10 English houses. But he couldn't take root in any of these. With chagrin he found his masters invariably whimsical and irregular, constantly running about the country, or on the lookout for adventure. His last master, young Lord Longferry, Member of Parliament, after passing his nights in the Haymarket taverns, was too often brought home in the morning on policemen's shoulders. Passepartout, desirous of respecting the gentleman whom he served, ventured a mild remonstrance on such conduct, which being ill received, he took his leave. Hearing that Mr. Phileas Fogg was looking for a servant, that his life was one of unbroken regularity, that he neither travelled nor stayed from home overnight, he felt sure that this would be the place that he was after. He presented himself and was accepted, as we had seen. At 11:30, then, Passepartout found himself alone in the house on Savile Row. He began its inspection without delay, scouring it from cellar to garret. So clean, well-arranged, solemn a mansion pleased him. It seemed to him like a snail shell, lighted and warmed by gas, which sufficed for both these purposes. When Passepartout reached the second story, he recognized at once the room in which he was to inhabit, and he was well satisfied with it. Electric bells and speaking tubes afforded communication on the lower stories, while on the mantel stood an electric clock precisely like that in Mr. Fogg's bedchamber, both beating the same second at the same instant. "That's good, that'll do," said Passepartout to himself. He suddenly observed, hung over the clock, a card, which upon inspection proved to be a programme of the daily routine of the house. It comprised all that was required of the servant, from 8 in the morning, exactly at which hour Phileas Fogg rose, until 11:30, when he left the house for the Reform Club. All the details of service: the tea and toast at 23 minutes past 8, the shaving water at 37 minutes past 9, and the toilet at 20 minutes before 10. Everything was regulated and foreseen that was to be done from 11:30 a.m. until midnight, the hour at which the methodical gentleman retired. Mr. Fogg's wardrobe was amply supplied and in the best taste. Each pair of trousers, coat, and vest bore a number, indicating the time of year and season at which they were in turn to be laid out for wearing, and the same system was applied to the master's shoes. In short, the house in Savile Row, which must have been a very temple of disorder and unrest under the illustrious but dissipated Sheridan, was coziness, comfort, and method idealized. There was no study, nor were there books, which would have been quite useless to Mr. Fogg. For at the Reform, 2 libraries, one of general literature and the other of law and politics, were at his service. A moderate-sized safe stood in his bedroom, constructed so as to defy fire as well as burglars, but Passepartout found neither arms nor hunting weapons anywhere. Everything betrayed the most tranquil and peaceable habits. Having scrutinized the house from top to bottom, he rubbed his hands, a broad smile overspreading his features, and he said joyfully, "Oh, this is just what I wanted. Oh, we'll get on together, Mr. Fogg and I. What a domestic and regular gentleman. A real machine. Well, I don't mind serving a machine." Chapter 3, in which a conversation takes place which seems likely to cost Phileas Fogg dear. Phileas Fogg, having shut the door of his house at 11:30, and having put his right foot before his left 575 times, and his left foot before his right 576 times, reached the Reform Club, an imposing edifice in Pall Mall, which could not have cost less than 3 millions. He repaired at once to the dining-room, the 9 windows of which opened upon a tasteful garden, where the trees were already gilded with an autumn colouring, and took his place at the habitual table, the cover of which had already been laid for him. His breakfast consisted of a side dish, a broiled fish with reading sauce, a scarlet slice of roast beef garnished with mushrooms, a rhubarb and gooseberry tart, and a morsel of Cheshire cheese, the whole being washed down with several cups of tea, for which the Reform is famous. He rose at 13 minutes to 1 and directed his steps toward the large hall, a stupendous apartment, adorned with lavishly framed paintings. A flunky handed him an uncut Times, which he proceeded to cut with a skill which betrayed familiarity with this delicate operation. The perusal of the paper absorbed Phileas Fogg until 4:15, whilst the Standard, his next task, occupied him until the dinner hour. Dinner passed as breakfast had done, and Mr. Fogg reappeared in the reading-room, and sat down to the Pall Mall 20 minutes before 6. Half an hour later, several members of the Reform came in and drew up to the fireplace, where a coal fire was steadily burning. They were Mr. Fogg's usual partners at whist, Andrew Stewart, an engineer, John Sullivan and Samuel Fallentin, bankers, Thomas Flanagan, a brewer, and Gauthier Ralph, one of the directors of the Bank of England, all rich and highly respectable personages, even in a club which comprises the princes of England, of English trade and finance. "Well, Ralph," said Flanagan, "what about that robbery?" "Oh, the bank will lose the money," replied Stewart. "On the contrary," broke in Ralph, "I hope we may put our hands on the robber. Skilful detectives have been sent to all the principal ports of America and the continent, and he'll be a clever fellow if he slips through their fingers." "But have you got the robber's description?" "In the first place, he's no robber at all." "What? A fellow who makes off with £50,000 no robber? No. Perhaps he's a manufacturer, then. The Daily Telegraph says he's a gentleman. It was Phileas Fogg, whose head now emerged from behind his newspapers, who had made this remark. He bowed to his friends and entered into the conversation. The affair which formed its subject, and which was town talk, had occurred 3 days before at the Bank of England. A package of banknotes to the value of £55,000 had been taken from the principal cashier's table, that functionary being at the moment engaged in registering the receipt of 3 shillings and 6 pence. Of course, he could not have had his eyes everywhere. Let it be observed that the Bank of England reposes a touching confidence in the honesty of the public. There are neither guards nor gratings to protect its treasures. Gold, silver, banknotes, they are freely exposed, at the mercy of the first comer. A keen observer of English customs relates that, being in one of the rooms of the bank one day, he had the curiosity to examine a gold ingot weighing some 7 or 8 pounds. He picked it up, scrutinized it, and passed it to his neighbor, he to the next man, and so on, until the ingot, having gone from hand to hand, was transferred to the end of a dark entry, nor did it return to its place for half an hour. Meanwhile, the cashier had not so much as raised his head. But in the present instance, things had not gone so smoothly. The package of notes not being found when 5 o'clock sounded from the ponderous clock in the drawing office, well, the amount was passed to the account of profit and loss. As soon as the robbery was discovered, picked detectives hastened off to Liverpool, Glasgow, Havre, Suez, Brinsden, New York, and other ports, inspired by the proffered reward of £2,000 and 5% on the sum that might be recovered. Detectives were also charged with narrowly watching those who arrived or left London by rail, and a judicial examination was at once entered upon. There were real grounds for supposing, as the Daily Telegraph said, that the thief did not belong to a professional band. On the day of the robbery, a well-dressed gentleman, of polished manners and with a well-to-do air, had been observed going to and fro in the paying room where the crime was committed. A description of him was easily procured and sent to the detectives, and some hopeful spirits, of whom Ralph was one, did not despair of his apprehension. The papers and clubs were full of the affair, and everywhere people were discussing the probabilities of a successful pursuit, and the Reform Club was especially agitated, several of its members being bank officials. Ralph would not concede that the work of the detectives was likely to be in vain, for he thought that the prize offered would greatly stimulate their zeal and activity. But Stewart was far from sharing this confidence, and as they placed themselves at the whist table, they continued to argue the matter. Stewart and Flanagan played together, while Phileas Fogg had Valentine for his partner. As the game proceeded, the conversation ceased, excepting between the rubbers when it revived again. "I maintain that the chances are in favour of the thief, who must be a shrewd fellow," said Stewart. "Well, but where can he fly to? No country safe for him," asked Ralph. "Pshaw! Where could he go, then?" "Oh, I don't know that. The world's big enough." "It was once," said Phileas Fogg in a low tone. "Cut, sir," he added, handing the cards to Thomas Flanagan. The discussion fell during the rubber, after which Stewart took up its thread. "What do you mean by once? Has the world grown smaller?" "Certainly. I agree with Mr. Fogg. The world's grown smaller, since a man can now go round it 10 times more quickly than 100 years ago. That's why the search for this thief will be more likely to succeed," returned Ralph. "And also why the thief can get away more easily." "Be so good as to play, Mr. Stewart," said Fogg. But the incredulous Stewart was not convinced, and when the hand was finished, said eagerly, "You've a strange way, Ralph, of proving the world's grown smaller. So because you can go round it in 3 months—" "In 80 days," interrupted Fogg. "That is true, gentlemen," added Sullivan. "Only 80 days, now that the section between Rithal and Aberhad on the great Indian Peninsula Railway has been opened. Here's the estimate made by the telegraph. From London to Suez, via Mont Cenis and Brinsden, by rail and steamboats, 7 days. From Suez to Bombay by steamer, 13 days. From Bombay to Calcutta by rail, 3 days. From Calcutta to Hong Kong by steamer, 13 days. From Hong Kong to Yokohama, Japan, by steamer in 6 days. From Yokohama to San Francisco by steamer in 22 days. From San Francisco to New York by rail in 7 days. From New York to London by steamer and rail in 9 days, for a total of 80 days. "Yes, in 80 days," exclaimed Stewart, who in his excitement had made a false deal. "But that doesn't take into account bad weather, contrary winds, shipwrecks, railway accidents, and things of that sort." "Oh, it's all included," returned Fogg, continuing to play despite the discussion. "But suppose someone pulls up the rails. Suppose they stop the trains, pillage the luggage vans, and, well, scalp the passengers." "All included," calmly retorted Fogg, adding as he threw down the cards, "2 trumps." Stewart, whose turn it was to deal, gathered them up and went on. "Oh, you're right, theoretically, Mr. Fogg, but practically—" "Practically also, Mr. Stewart." "I'd like to see you do it in 80 days. "It depends on you. Shall we go?" "Heaven preserve me, but I'd wager £4,000 that such a journey, made under these conditions, is impossible." "Quite possible, on the contrary." "Well, make it, then." "The journey round the world in 80 days?" "Yes." "I should like nothing better." "When?" "At once. Only I warn you that I shall do it at your expense." "It's absurd," cried Stewart, who was beginning to be annoyed at the persistency of his friend. "Come on, let's go with the game." "Deal over, then, again. There's a false deal." Stewart took up the pack with a feverish hand and then suddenly put down them again. "Well, Mr. Fogg, shall it be so? I'll wager the 4,000 on it." "Calm yourself, my dear Stewart. It's only a joke." "When I say I wager, I mean it." "All right," said Mr. Fogg, and turning to the others, continued, "I have a deposit of 20,000 at Barings, which I will willingly risk upon it."
£20,000!
cried Sullivan.
£20,000 which you shall lose by a single accidental delay.
"The unforeseen does not exist."
"But, Mr. Fogg, 80 days is only the estimate of least possible time in which the journey can be made."
"A well-used minimum suffices for everything."
"But in order not to exceed it, you must jump mathematically from the trains upon the steamers and the steamers upon the trains again."
"I'll jump mathematically, then."
"You're joking."
"A true Englishman doesn't joke when he's talking about so serious a thing as a wager," replied Fogg solemnly. "I will bet £20,000 against anyone who wishes that I will make the tour of the world in 80 days or less, in 1920 hours or 115,202 minutes. Do you accept?"
"We accept,"
replied the Messrs. Oh, jeez. Oh, that is Misters, yes. "We accept," replied Misters Stewart, Valentine, Sullivan, Flanagan, and Ralph, after consulting each other.
"Good."
Wait, no, that's Fogg. "Good. The train leaves for Dover at 9:15. I'll take that."
"This very evening?"
"This very evening," returned Fogg. He took out and consulted a pocket almanac and added, "As today is Wednesday, the 2nd of October, I shall be due in London, in this very room of the Reform Club, on Saturday, the 21st of December, at 9:15 p.m., or else the £20,000 now deposited in my name at the Barings will belong to you. In fact, and in right, gentlemen, here is a cheque for the amount." A memorandum of the wager was at once drawn up and signed by the 6 parties, during which Phileas Fogg preserved a stoical composure. He certainly didn't bet to win, and had only staked the £20,000, half of his fortune, because he foresaw that he might have to expend the other half to carry out this difficult, not to say unattainable, project. As for his antagonists, they seemed much agitated, not so much by the value of their stake, as because they had some scruples about betting under conditions so difficult to their friend. The clock struck 7, and the party offered to suspend the game so that Mr. Fogg may make his preparations for the departure. I'm quite ready now," was his tranquil response. "Diamonds or trumps, be so good as to play, gentlemen." Chapter 4, in which Phileas Fogg astounds Passepartout, his servant. Having won 20 guineas at whist and taking leave of his friends, Phileas Fogg, at 25 minutes past 7, left the Reform Club. Passepartout, who had conscientiously studied the programme of his duties, was more than surprised to see his master guilty of the inexactness of appearing at an unaccustomed hour, for according to rule he wasn't due in Savile Row until precisely midnight. Mr. Fogg repaired to his bedroom and called out, "Passepartout?" Passepartout didn't reply. It could not be he who was called. It was not the right hour. "Passepartout?" repeated Mr. Fogg without raising his voice, and at this point Passepartout made his appearance. "I've called you twice."
But it's not midnight," responded the other, showing his watch.
"I know it is. I don't blame you. We start for Dover and Calais in 10 minutes. A puzzled grin overspread Passepartout's round face. Clearly he had not comprehended his master. "Monsieur is going to leave home?" "Yes, we are going round the world." Passepartout opened wide his eyes, raised his eyebrows, and held up his hands, and seemed about to collapse, so overcome was he with a stupefied astonishment.
"Round the world?"
"In 80 days, so we haven't a moment to lose."
"But the trunks?"
gasped Passepartout, unconsciously swaying his head from right to left. "We'll have no trunks, only a carpet bag with 2 shirts and 3 pairs of stockings for me, and the same for you. We'll buy our clothes on the way. Bring down my mackintosh and travelling cloak, and some stout shoes, though we shall do a little walking. Make haste." Passepartout tried to reply, but he couldn't. He went out, mounted to his own room, and fell into a chair, and muttered, "That's good, that is, and I, who wanted to remain quiet." And yet he mechanically set about making the preparations for departure. Around the world in 80 days. Was his master a fool? No. Was this a joke, then? They were going to Dover. Good. To Calais. Good again. After all, Passepartout, who had been away from France 5 years, would not be sorry to set foot on his native soil again. Perhaps they would go as far as Paris, and it would do his eyes good to see Paris once more. But surely a gentleman so chary of his steps would stop there, no doubt. But then it was none the less true that he was going away, this so domestic person hitherto. By 8 o'clock Passepartout had packed the modest carpet-bag, containing the wardrobes of his master and himself, and then, still troubled in mind, he carefully shut the door of his room and descended to Mr. Fogg. Mr. Fogg was quite ready. Under his arm might have been observed a red-bound copy of Bradshaw's Continental Railway Steam Transit and General Guide, with its timetable showing the arrival and departure of steamers and railways. He took the carpet-bag, opened it, and slipped it into a goodly roll of Bank of England notes, which would pass wherever he might go. "You have forgotten nothing?"
"Nothing, monsieur."
"My mackintosh and cloak?"
"Here they are."
"Good. Take this carpet-bag," handing it to Passepartout. "Take good care of it. There are 20,000 pounds in it." Passepartout nearly dropped the bag as if the 20,000 pounds were in gold, and weighed him down. Master and man then descended. The street door was double-locked, and at the end of the Savile Road they took a cab and drove rapidly to Charing Cross. The cab stopped before the railway station at 20 minutes past 8. And Passepartout jumped off the box and followed his master, who, after paying the cabman, was about to enter the station, when a poor beggar-woman, with a child in her arms, her naked feet smeared with mud, her head covered with a wretched bonnet, from which hung a tattered feather, and her shoulders shrouded in a ragged shawl, approached and mournfully asked for alms. Mr. Fogg took out the 20 guineas he had just won at whist, and handed them to the beggar, saying, "Here, my good woman, I'm glad that I met you," and passed on. Passepartout had a moist sensation about the eyes. His master's action touched his susceptible heart. 2 first-class tickets for Paris having been speedily purchased, Mr. Fogg was crossing the station to the train, when he perceived his 5 friends of the Reform. "Well, gentlemen, I'm off, you see, and if you will examine my passport when I get back, you'll be able to judge whether I've accomplished the journey agreed upon."
"Oh, that would be quite unnecessary, Mr. Fogg. We trust your word as a gentleman of honor." "You do not forget what you're due in London again?"
"In 80 days, on Saturday." the 21st of December, 1872, at 9:15 p.m. Goodbye, gentlemen." Phileas Fogg and his servant seated themselves in a first-class carriage at 9:20. 5 minutes later the whistle screamed, and the train slowly glided out of the station. The night was dark, and a fine, steady rain was falling. Phileas Fogg, snugly ensconced in his corner, did not open his lips, and Passepartout, not yet recovered from his stupefaction, clung mechanically to the carpet-bag with its enormous treasure. Just as the train was whirling through Sydenham, Passepartout suddenly uttered a cry of despair. "What's the matter?"
"Alas, in my hurry, I forgot."
"What?"
"To turn off the gas in my room."
"Very well, young man. It will burn at your expense." Chapter 5, in which a new species of funds, unknown to the moneyed men, appears on 'Change. Phileas Fogg rightly suspected that his departure from London would create a lively sensation at the West End. The news of the bet spread through the Reform Club, and afforded an exciting topic of conversation to its members. From the club it soon got into the papers throughout England. The boasted tour of the world was talked about, disputed, argued with as much warmth as if the subject were another Alabama claim. Some took sides with Phileas Fogg, but a large majority shook their heads and declared against him. It was absurd, impossible. They declared that the tour of the world could be made, except theoretically and on paper, in such a minimum of time, and with the existing means of travelling. The Times, the Standard, Morning Post, and Daily News, and 20 other highly respectable newspapers scouted Mr. Fogg's project as madness. The Daily Telegraph alone hesitatingly supported him. People in general thought him a lunatic and blamed his Reform Club friends for having accepted a wager which betrayed the mental aberration of its proposer. Articles no less passionate than logical appeared on the question, for geography is one of the pet subjects of the English, and the columns devoted to Phileas Fogg's venture were eagerly devoured by all classes of readers. At first, some rash individuals, they espoused his cause, which became still more popular when the Illustrated London News came out with his portrait, copied from a photograph in the Reform Club. A few readers of the Daily Telegraph even dared to say, "Why not, after all? Stranger things have come to pass." At last a long article appeared on the 7th of October in the Bulletin of the Royal Geographical Society, which treated the question from every point of view, and demonstrated the utter folly of the enterprise. Everything it said was against the travellers, every obstacle imposed by alike man and nature. A miraculous agreement of the times of departure and arrival, which was impossible, was absolutely necessary to his success. He might perhaps reckon on the arrival of trains at the designated hours in Europe, where the distances were relatively moderate, but when he calculated upon crossing India in 3 days and the United States in 7, could he rely, beyond misgiving, in accomplishing his task? There were accidents to machinery, the inability of trains to stay on the lines, collisions, bad weather, the blocking up by snow. Were these not all against Phileas Fogg? Would he not find himself, when travelling by steamer in winter, be at the mercy of winds and fogs? Is it uncommon for the best ocean steamers to be 2 or 3 days behind time? But a single delay would suffice to fatally break the chain of communication. Should Phileas Fogg once miss, even by an hour, a steamer, he'd have to wait for the next, and that would irretrievably render his attempt vain. This article made a great deal of noise, and it was copied into all the papers, and it seriously depressed the advocates of the rash tourist. Everyone knows that England is the world of betting men, who are of a higher class than mere gamblers. To bet is in the English temperament. Not only the members of the Reform, but of the general public made heavy wagers for or against Phileas Fogg, who was set down in the betting books as if he were a racehorse. Bonds were issued and made their appearance at 'Change. Phileas Fogg bonds were offered at par or at a premium, and a great business was done in them. But 5 days after the article in the Bulletin of the Geographical Society, the demand began to subside, and Phileas Fogg declined. They were offered by packages, at first of 5, and then of 10, and then at last, when nobody would take less than 20, 50, 100. Lord Albemarle, an elderly paralytic gentleman, was now the only advocate of Phileas Fogg left. This noble lord, who was fastened to his chair, would have given his fortune to be able to make the tour of the world if it took 10 years, and he bet £5,000 on Phileas Fogg. When the folly as well as the uselessness of the adventure was pointed out to him, he contented himself with replying,
"If the thing is feasible, the first to do it ought to be an Englishman."
The Fogg party dwindled more and more. Everybody was going against him, and the bet stood 150 to 200. 150 and 200 to 1. And a week after his departure, an incident occurred which deprived him of backers at any price. The commissioner of police was sitting in his office at 9 o'clock one evening, when the following telegraphic dispatch was put into his hands.
Suez to London. Rowan.
Commissioner of Police, Scotland Yard.
I've found the bank robber, Phileas Fogg. Send without delay. Warrant of arrest to Bombay. Fix detective.
The effect of this dispatch was instantaneous. The polished gentleman disappeared to give place to the bank robber. His photograph, which was hung with those of the rest of the members of the Reform Club, was minutely examined, and it betrayed, feature by feature, the description of the robber which had been provided to the police. The mysterious habits of Phileas Fogg were recalled, his solitary ways, his sudden departure, and it seemed clear that in undertaking a tour round the world on the pretext of a wager, he had no other end in view than to elude the detectives and throw him off his track. Chapter 6, in which Fix, the detective, betrays a very natural impatience. The circumstances under which this telegraphic dispatch about Phileas Fogg were sent were as follows. The steamer Mongolia, belonging to the Peninsular and Oriental Company, built of iron, of 2,800 tons burden and 500 horsepower, was due at 11 o'clock a.m. on Wednesday the 9th of October, at Suez. The Mongolia plied regularly between Brinsde and Bombay via the Suez Canal, and was one of the fastest steamers belonging to the company, always making more than 10 knots an hour between Brinsde and Suez, and 9.5 between Suez and Bombay. 2 men were promenading up and down the wharves, among the crowd of natives and strangers who were sojourning at this once straggling village, now to the thanks of the enterprise of Monsieur Lesseps, a fast-growing town. One was the British consul at Suez, who, despite the prophecies of the English government and the unfavourable predictions of Stevenson, was in the habit of seeing, from his office window, English ships daily passing to and fro on the Great Canal, by which the old roundabout route from England to India by the Cape of Good Hope was abridged by at least a half. The other was a small, slight-built personage with a nervous, intelligent face, and bright eyes peering out from under eyebrows, which were incessantly twitching. He was just now manifesting unmistakable signs of impatience, nervously pacing up and down, and unable to stand still for a moment. This was Fix, one of the detectives who had been dispatched from England in search of the bank robber. It was his task to narrowly watch every passenger who arrived at Suez, and to follow up all who seemed to be suspicious characters, or who bore a resemblance to the description of the criminal, which he had received 2 days before from the police headquarters at London. The detective was evidently inspired by the hope of obtaining the splendid reward which would be the prize of success, and awaited with a feverish impatience, easy to understand, the arrival of the steamer Mongolia.
"So you say, Counsel," he asked for the 20th time, "are the steamers never behind time?" "No, sir, Mr. Fix. She was spoken yesterday at Port Said, and the rest of the way is no account of such a craft. I repeat that the Mongolia has been in advance of the time required by the company's regulations, and gained the prize awarded for excess of speed."
"Does she come directly from Brinsde?"
"Directly from Razzy. She takes on the Indian mails there. She left there Saturday at 5 p.m. Have patience, Mr. Fix. She will not be late. But really I don't see how, from the description you have, you'll be able to recognize your man even if he is on board the Mongolia."
"A man rather feels the presence of these fellows, Counsel, than recognizes them. You have to have a scent for him, and a sense like a sixth sense which combines hearing, seeing, and, well, smelling. I have arrested more than one of these gentlemen in my time, and if my thief is on board, he'll answer for it. He'll not slip through my fingers."
"I hope so, Mr. Fix. It was a heavy robbery." A magnificent robbery, Counsel. 55,000 pounds. We don't often have such windfalls. Burglars are to be getting so contemptible nowadays. I feel like it's hung for a handful of shillings. Mr. Fix, I like your way of talking, and I hope you'll succeed, but I fear you'll find it far from easy. Don't you see the description which you have there has a singular resemblance to an honest man? Counsel, replied the detective dogmatically, great robbers always resemble honest folks. Fellows who have rascally faces only have one course to take, and that's to remain honest. Otherwise they'd be arrested offhand. The artistic thing is to unmask honest countenances. It's no light task, I admit, but it's a real art.
Mr. Fix was evidently not wanting in a tinge of self-conceit. Little by little the scene on which the quay became more animated. Sailors of various nations, merchants, shipbrokers, porters, fellas, bustled to and fro as if the steamer were immediately expected. The weather was clear and slightly chilly. The minarets of the town loomed above the houses in pale rays of the sun. A jetty pier, some 2,000 yards long, extended into the roadstead. A number of fishing smacks and coasting boats, some retaining the fantastic fashion of ancient galleys, were discernible on the Red Sea. As he passed among the busy crowd, Fix, according to habit, scrutinized the passers-by with a keen, rapid glance. It was now 10:30.
The steamer doesn't come,
he exclaimed as the port clock struck.
She can't be far off now. How long does she stop at Suez?
4 hours, long enough to get into coal. It's 1,310 miles from Suez to Aden. At the other end of the Red Sea, she has to take in a fresh coal supply.
And does she go from Suez directly to Bombay?
Without putting in anywhere.
Good. If the robber's on board, he'll no doubt get off at Suez so as to reach the Dutch or French colonies in Asia by some other route. He ought to know that he wouldn't be safe an hour in India, which is English soil.
Unless he is exceptionally shrewd. An English criminal, you know, is always better concealed in London than anywhere else.
This observation furnished the detective food for thought, and meanwhile the counsel went away to his office. Fix, left alone, was more impatient than ever, having a presentiment that the robber was on board the Mongolia. If he had indeed left London, intending to reach the New World, he would naturally take the route via India, which was less watched and more difficult to watch than that of the Atlantic. But Fix's reflections were soon interrupted by a succession of sharp whistles, which announced the arrival of the Mongolia. The porters and fellows rushed down the quay, and a dozen boats pushed off from the shore to go and meet the steamer. Soon her gigantic hull appeared passing along between the banks, and 11 o'clock struck as she anchored in the road. She brought an unusual number of passengers, some of whom remained on deck to scan the picturesque panorama of the town, while the greater part disembarked in the boats and landed on the quay. Fix took up a position and carefully examined each face and figure which made its appearance. Presently one of the passengers, after vigorously pushing his way through the importunate crowd of porters, came up to him and politely asked if he could point out the English consulate, at the same time showing a passport which he wished to have visaed. Fix instinctively took the passport, and with a rapid glance read the description of its bearer. An involuntary motion of surprise nearly escaped him, for the description of the passport was identical with that of the bank robber which he had received from Scotland Yard.
Is this your passport?
No, it's my...
No, it's my master's.
And your
master is?
He stayed on board.
But he must go to the consul's in person so as to establish identity.
Oh, is that necessary?
Quite indispensable.
And where is the consulate?
My apologies for that shouting. Where was I?
And where is the consulate? There, on the corner of the square, said Fix, pointing to a house 200 steps off.
I'll go and fetch my master, who won't be much pleased, however, to be disturbed.
The passenger bowed to Fix and returned to the steamer. Chapter 7, which once more demonstrates the uselessness of passports as aids to detectives. The detective passed down the quay and rapidly made his way to the consul's office, where at once he was admitted to the presence of that official. "Consul," he said without preamble. Oh, wait, no, this is a detective.
"Consul, I have strong reasons for believing that my man is a passenger on the Mongolia."
And he narrated what had just passed concerning the passport.
Well, Mr. Fix, I shall not be sorry to see that rascal's face, but perhaps he won't come here. That is, if he is the person you suppose him to be. A robber doesn't quite like to leave traces of his flight behind him, and besides, he's not obligated to have his passport countersigned.
If he's as shrewd as I think he is, Counsel, he'll come here.
To have his passport reset?
Yes, passports are only good for annoying honest folks and aiding in the flight of rogues. I assure you it'll be quite the thing for him to do, but I hope you will not visa the passport.
Why not? If the passport is genuine, I have no right to refuse.
Still, I must keep this man here until I can get a warrant to arrest him from London.
That's your lookout, but I cannot.
The counsel couldn't finish his sentence, for as he spoke a knock was heard at the door, and 2 strangers entered, one of whom was the servant whom Fix had met on the quay. The other, who was his master, held out his passport with a request that the counsel would do him the favour to visa it. The counsel took the document and carefully read it, whilst Fix observed, or rather devoured, the stranger with his eyes from a corner of the room.
You are Mr. Phileas Fogg?
I am.
And this man is your servant?
He is. A Frenchman named Passepartout.
You are from London?
Yes.
And you are going?
To Bombay.
Very good, sir. You know that a visa is useless and that no passport is required?
I know it, sir, but I wish to prove by your visa that I came by Suez.
Very well, sir.
The counsel proceeded to sign and date the passport, after which he added his official seal. Mr. Fogg paid the customary fee, coldly bowed, and went out, followed by his servant.
Well?
Well, he looks and acts like a perfectly honest man,
replied the counsel.
Possibly, but that's not the question. Do you think, Consul, that this phlegmatic gentleman resembles feature by feature the robber whose description I've received?
I could see that, but then, all descriptions...
I'll make certain of it. The servant seems to me less mysterious than the master. Besides, he's a Frenchman. He can't help talking. Excuse me for a little while, Consul.
Fix started off in search of Passepartout. Meanwhile, Mr. Fogg, after leaving the consulate, repaired to the quay, gave some orders to Passepartout, and went off to the Mongolia in the boat, and descended to his cabin. He took up his notebook, which contained the following memoranda. Left London, Wednesday, October 2nd, at 8:45 p.m. Reached Paris, Thursday, October 3rd, 7:20 a.m. Left Paris, Thursday, at 8:40 a.m. Reached Turin by Mount Cenis, Friday, October 4th, 6:35 a.m. Left Turin, Friday, 7:20 a.m. Arrived at Brindisi, Saturday, October 5th, at 4 p.m. Sailed on the Mongolia, Saturday at 5 p.m. Reached Suez, Wednesday, October 9th, at 11 a.m. Total of hours spent, 158 plus, or in days, 6 days and a half. These dates were inscribed in an itinerary, divided into columns indicating the month, the day of the month, and the day for the stipulated and actual arrivals at each principal point: Paris, Brindisi, Suez, Bombay, Calcutta, Singapore, Hong Kong, Yokohama, San Francisco, New York, and London, from the 2nd of October to the 21st of December, and giving a space for setting down the gain made or the loss suffered on arrival at each locality. This methodical record thus contained an account of everything needed, and Mr. Fogg always knew whether he was behindhand or in advance of his time. On this Friday, October 9th, he had noted his arrival at Suez, and observed that he had, as yet, neither gained nor lost. He sat down quietly to breakfast in his cabin, never once thinking of inspecting the town, being one of those Englishmen who are wont to see foreign countries through the eyes of their domestics. Chapter 8, in which Passepartout talks rather more than perhaps is prudent. Fix soon rejoined Passepartout, who was lounging and looking about on the quay as if he didn't feel that he, at least, was obliged not to see anything.
Well, my friend, is your passport visaed? Oh, yes, it's you, monsieur. Thanks, yes, the passport is all right. And you're looking about you? Yes, but we travel so fast, I seem to be journeying in a dream. So this is Suez? Yes. In Egypt. Certainly in Egypt. And in Africa. In Africa. In Africa. Just think, monsieur, I had no idea that we should go farther than Paris, and all that I saw of Paris was 20 minutes past 7 and 20 minutes before 9 in the morning. Between the Northern and Lyons stations, through the windows of a car, and in a driving rain. How I regret not having seen once more Père Lachaise and the circus in the Champs-Élysées. You're in a great hurry, then. I am not, but my master is. By the way, I must buy some shoes and shirts. We came away without trunks, only a carpet bag. I'll show you an excellent shop for getting what you want. Really, monsieur, you are very kind. And they walked off together, Passepartout chatting volubly as they went along. Above all, don't let me lose the steamer. Yeah, you got plenty of time. It's only 12 o'clock. Passepartout pulled out his big watch. 12? Why, it's only 8 minutes before 10. Your watch is slow. My watch, a family watch, monsieur, which has come down from my great-grandfather. It doesn't vary 5 minutes in the year. It's a perfect chronometer. Look you. I see how it is. You've kept London time, which is 2 hours behind that of Suez. You ought to regulate your watch at noon in each country. Regulate my watch? Never. Well, then, that's not the right voice. Well, then it won't agree with the sun. So much the worse for the sun, monsieur. The sun will be wrong, then. And the worthy fellow returned the watch to its fob with a defiant gesture. After a few minutes' silence, Fix resumed. You left London hastily, then? I rather think so. Last Friday at 8 o'clock in the evening, Monsieur Fogg came home from his club, and 3/4 of an hour afterwards we were off. Where's your master going? Oh, he's straight ahead. He's going around the world. Around the world? Yes, in 80 days. He says it's on a wager, but between us, I don't believe a word of it. That wouldn't be common sense. There's something else in the wind. Mr. Fogg's a character, is he? I should say he was. Is he rich? No doubt, for he's carrying an enormous sum in brand new banknotes with him. He doesn't spare the money on the way either. He's offered a large reward to the engineer of the Mongolia if he gets us to Bombay well in advance of time. And you've known your master a long time? Oh, I know. I entered his service the day we left London.
The effect of these replies upon the already suspicious and excited detective were pretty easily imagined. The hasty departure from London soon after the robbery, the large sum carried by Mr. Fogg, his eagerness to reach distant countries, the pretext of an eccentric and foolhardy bet, all confirmed Fix in his theories. He continued to pump poor Passepartout, and learned that he really knew little or nothing of his master, who lived a solitary existence in London, was said to be rich, though no one knew whence came his riches, and was mysterious and impenetrable to affairs and habits. Fix felt sure that Phileas Fogg would not land at Suez, but really was going on to Bombay. Is Bombay far from here? Pretty far. It's 10 days' voyage by sea. And in what country is Bombay? India. In Asia? Certainly. I was going to tell you there's one thing that worries me, my burner. What burner? My gas burner, which I forgot to turn off, and which is at this moment burning at my expense. I've calculated, monsieur, that I lose 2 shillings every 24 hours, exactly 6 pence more than I earn, and you'll understand that the longer our journey... Did Fix pay any attention to Passepartout's trouble about the gas? It's not probable. He wasn't listening, but he was cogitating a project. Passepartout and he had now reached the shop, where Fix left his companion to make his purchases, after recommending him not to miss the steamer, and hurried back to the consulate. Now that he was fully convinced, Fix had quite recovered his equanimity. Counsel, I have no longer any doubt. I've spotted my man. He passes himself as an odd stick who's gone around the world in 80 days. Well, that is a sharp fellow. Encountered returning to London after putting the police of 2 countries off his track. Yeah, we'll see about that. But are you not mistaken? I'm not mistaken. Why was this robber so anxious to prove by the visa that he'd passed through Suez? Why? I have no idea, but listen to me.
He reported in few words the most important parts of his conversation with Passepartout.
In short, the appearances are wholly against this man, and what are you going to do? Send a dispatch to London for a warrant of arrest to be dispatched instantly to Bombay. Take passage on board the Mongolia, follow my rogue to India, and there on English ground arrest him politely, with my warrant in my hand and my hand on his shoulder.
Having uttered these words with a cool, careless air, the detective took leave of the consul and repaired to the telegraph office, whence he sent the dispatch which we have seen to the London post office. A quarter of an hour later found Fix with a small bag in his hand, proceeding on board the Mongolia, and ere many moments longer, the noble steamer rode out at full steam upon the waters of the Red Sea. Chapter 9, in which the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean proved propitious to the designs of Phileas Fogg. The distance between Suez and Aden is precisely 1,310 miles, and the regulations of the company allow the steamers 138 hours in which to traverse it. The Mongolia, thanks to the vigorous exertions of the engineer, seemed likely, so rapid was her speed, to reach the destination considerably within that time. The greater part of the passengers from Brindisi were bound for India, some for Bombay, others for Calcutta by way of Bombay, the nearest route thither, now that a railway crosses the Indian peninsula. Among the passengers was a number of officials and military officers of various grades, the latter being either attached to the regular British forces or commanding the sepoy troops, and receiving high salaries ever since the central government has assumed the powers of the East India Company. For the sub-lieutenants get £280, brigadiers £2,400, and generals of divisions £4,000. What with the military men, a number of rich young Englishmen on their travels, and the hospitable efforts of the purser, the time passed quickly on the Mongolia. The best of fare was spread upon the cabin tables at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and the 8 o'clock supper, and the ladies scrupulously changed their toilets twice a day. The hours were whirled away when the sea was tranquil, with music, dancing, and games. But the Red Sea is full of caprice and often boisterous, like most long and narrow gulfs. When the wind came from the African or Asian coast, the Mongolia, with a long hull, rolled fearfully. Then the ladies speedily disappeared below. The pianos were silent, singing and dancing suddenly ceased. And yet the good ship ploughed straight on, unbothered by wind or wave, toward the straits of Bab el-Medeb. What was Phileas Fogg doing all this time? It might be thought that in his anxiety he'd be constantly watching the changes of the wind, the disorderly raging of the billows, every chance, in short, which might force the Mongolia to slacken her speed and thus interrupt his journey. But if he thought of these possibilities, he didn't betray the fact by any outward sign. Always the same impassible member of the Reform Club, whom no incidents could surprise, as unvarying as the ship's chronometers, and seldom having the curiosity to even go upon the deck, he passed through the memorable scenes of the Red Sea with a cold indifference. He didn't care to recognize the historic towns and villages which, along its borders, raised their picturesque outlines against the sky, and betrayed no fear of the dangers of the Arabic Gulf, which the old historians always spoke of with horror, and upon which the ancient navigators never ventured without propitiating the gods by ample sacrifices. How did this eccentric personage pass his time in the Mongolia? He made his 4 hearty meals every day, regardless of the most persistent rolling and pitching on the part of the steamer, and he played whist indefatigably, for he had found partners as enthusiastic in the game as himself. A tax collector on his way to the post at Goa, the Reverend Decimus Smith returning to his parish at Bombay, and a brigadier general of the English army, who was about to rejoin his brigade at Berneris, made up the party, and, with Mr. Fogg, played whist by the hour together in the absorbing silence. As for Passepartout, he too had escaped seasickness, and took his meals conscientiously in the forward cabin. He rather enjoyed the voyage, for he was well fed and well lodged, took a great interest in the scenes through which they were passing, and consoled himself with the delusion that his master's whim would end at Bombay, He was pleased on the day after leaving Suez to find on deck the obliging person with whom he had walked and chatted on the quays.
"If I am not mistaken," said he, approaching this person with his most amiable smile, "you are the gentleman who so kindly volunteered to guide me at Suez?" "Oh, I quite recognize you. You're the servant of the strange Englishman, right?" "Oh, just so, monsieur." "I'm Fix. I'm Fix. Monsieur Fix, I'm charmed to find you on board. Where are you bound?" "Like you, to Bombay." "Oh, that's capital. Have you made this trip before?" "Several times. I'm one of the agents of the Peninsular Company." "Then you know India?" "Oh, why, yes. A curious place is India." Oh, very curious. Mosques, minarets, temples, fakirs, pagodas, tigers, snakes, elephants. I hope you'll have ample time to see the sights." "Oh, I hope so, Monsieur Fix. You see, a man of sound sense ought not to spend his life jumping upon a steamer to a railway train, and from a railway train upon a steamer again, pretending to take the tour of the world in 80 days. No, all these gymnastics, you shall be sure, will cease at Bombay." "And Mr. Fogg's getting on well?" asked Fix, in the most natural tone in the world. "Quite well, and I too. I eat like a famished ogre. It's the sea air." "But I never see your master on deck." "Oh, never. He hasn't the least curiosity." "Do you know, Mr. Passepartout, that this pretended tour in 80 days may conceal some secret errand, perhaps a diplomatic mission?" "Oh, faith, Monsieur Fix, I assure you I know nothing about it, nor would I give half a crown to find out."
After this meeting, Passepartout and Fix got into the habit of chatting together, the latter making it a point to gain the worthy man's confidence. He frequently offered him a glass of whiskey or pale ale in the steamer bar-room, which Passepartout never failed to accept with graceful alacrity, mentally pronouncing Fix the best of good fellows. Meanwhile, the Mongolia was pushing forward rapidly. On the 13th, Mocha, surrounded by its ruined walls whereon date trees were growing, was sighted, and on the mountains beyond were spied vast coffee fields. Passepartout was ravished to behold this celebrated place, and thought that with its circular walls and dismantled fort, it looked like an immense coffee cup and saucer. The following night they passed through the Strait of Bab el Mandeb, which means in Arabic the Bridge of Tears, and the next day they put in at Steamer Point, northwest of Aden Harbor, to take in coal. This matter of fueling steamers is a serious one at such distances from the coal mines. It costs the Peninsular Company some £800,000 a year. In these distant seas, coal is worth 3 or 4 pounds sterling a ton. The Mongolia still had 1,650 miles to traverse before reaching Bombay, and was obliged to remain 4 hours at Steamer Point to coal up. But this delay, as it was foreseen, did not affect Phileas Fogg's program. Besides, the Mongolia, instead of reaching Aden on the morning of the 15th, when she was due, arrived there on the evening of the 14th. A gain of 15 hours. Mr. Fogg and his servant went ashore at Aden to have the passport again visaed. Fix, unobserved, followed them. The visa procured, Mr. Fogg returned on board to resume his former habits, while Passepartout, according to custom, sauntered about among the mixed population of Somalis, Banyans, Parsis, Jewish, Arabs, and Europeans who comprised the 25,000 inhabitants of Aden. He gazed with wonder upon the fortifications which make this place the Gibraltar of the Indian Ocean, and the vast cisterns where the English engineers were still at work, 2,000 years after the engineers of Solomon. "Oh, very curious, said Passepartout to himself on returning to the steamer. I see that it is by no means useless to travel if a man wants to see something new." At 6 p.m. the Mongolia slowly moved out of the roadstead and was soon once more on the Indian Ocean. She had 168 hours in which to reach Bombay, and the sea was favorable, the wind being in the northwest and all sails aiding the engine. The steamer rolled but little, and the ladies in their fresh toilet reappeared on deck, and the singing and dancing were resumed. The trip was being accomplished most successfully, and Passepartout was enchanted with a congenial companion, which chance has secured him in the person of the delightful Fix. On Sunday, October 20th, towards noon, they came in sight of the Indian coast. 2 hours later, the pilot came on board. A range of hills lay against the sky and the horizon, and soon the rows of palms which adorn Bombay came distinctly into view. The steamer entered the road formed by the islands in the bay, and at 4:30 she hauled up at the quays of Bombay. Phileas Fogg was in the act of finishing the 33rd rubber of the voyage, and his partner and himself having, by a bold stroke, captured all 13 of the tricks, concluded this fine campaign with a brilliant victory. The Mongolia was due at Bombay on the 22nd. She arrived on the 20th. This was gained to Phileas Fogg 2 days since his departure from London, and he calmly entered the fact in the itinerary in the column of gains. Alright, y'all, it's been about an hour. We're at a chapter boundary, so I'm going to give you all just a few moments to get up, get your stretch on, walk around. It's not good for you to sit still for, more than a few hours at a time. Maybe get some water, maybe a snack if if you're hungry. So feel free to pause the video right now. Chapter 10, in which Passport Out... Ooh, I bumped my microphone. That's gross. Chapter 10, in which Passepartout is only too glad to get off with his loss of his shoes. Everybody knows that the great reverse triangle of land, with its base in the north and its apex in the south, which is called India, embraces 1,400,000 square miles, upon which is spread unequally a population of 180 million souls. The British Crown exercises a very real and despotic dominion over the larger portion of this vast country, as a Governor-General stationed at Calcutta, governors at Madras, Bombay, and in Bengal, and a Lieutenant Governor at Agra. But British India, properly so called, only embraces 700,000 square miles, and a population from 100 to 110 millions of inhabitants. A considerable portion of India is still free from British authority, and there are certain ferocious Rajas in the interior who are absolutely independent. The celebrated East India Company was all-powerful from 1756, when the English first gained a foothold on the spot where now stands the city of Madras, down to the time of the Great Sepoy insurrection. It gradually annexed province after province, purchasing them of the native chiefs, who had seldom paid, and appointed the Governor-General and his subordinates, civil and military. But the East India Company had now passed away, leaving the British possessions in India directly under the control of the Crown. The aspect of the country, as well as the manners and distinctions of race, is daily changing. Formerly one was obliged to travel in India by the old cumbrous methods of going on foot or on horseback, in palanquins or unwieldy coaches. Now fast steamboats ply on the Indus and Ganges, and a great railway with branched lines joining the main line at many points on its route traverses the peninsula from Bombay to Calcutta in 3 days. This railway doesn't run a direct line across India. The distance between Bombay and Calcutta as the bird flies is only from 100,000 to 1,100 miles. But the deflections of the road increase this distance by more than a third. The general route of the Great Indian Peninsula Railway is as follows. Leaving Bombay, it passes through Salsette, crossing the continent opposite Tana, goes over the chain of the Western Ghauts, runs thence northeast as far as Burhanpur, skirts the nearly independent territory of Bundelkhand, ascends to Allahabad, then turns thence eastwardly, meeting the Ganges at Benares, and then departs from the river a little, and descending southeastward by Burvadan and the French town of Chandernagore, has its terminus at Calcutta. The passengers of the Mongolia went ashore at 4:30 p.m. At exactly 8, the train would start for Calcutta. Mr. Fogg, after bidding goodbye to his whist partners, left the steamer, gave his servants several errands to do, urged it upon him to be at the station promptly at 8, and with his regular step, which beat to the second like an astronomical clock, directed his steps to the passport office. As for the wonders of Bombay, its famous city hall, splendid library, its forts and docks, its bazaars, mosques, synagogues, its Armenian churches, and the noble pagoda on Malabar Hill with its 2 polygonal towers, he cared not a straw to see them. He would not deign to examine even the masterpieces of Elephanta, or the mysterious hypogea, concealed southeast from the docks, or those fine remains of Buddhist architecture, the Canarian grottos of the island of Salsette. Having transacted his business at the passport office, Phileas Fogg repaired quietly to the railway station, where he ordered dinner. Among the dishes served to him, the landlord especially recommended a certain giblet of native rabbit, on which he prided himself. Mr. Fogg accordingly tasted the dish, but despite its spice sauce, found it far from palatable. He rang for the landlord, and on its appearance, said, fixing his clear eyes upon him, "Is this the rabbit, sir?"
"Yes, my lord. Rabbit perfect English."
And did this rabbit not mew when he was killed?"
Mew, my lord. What a rabbit mew, I swear to you."
"Be so good, landlord, as to not swear. But remember this. Cats were formerly considered in India as sacred animals. That was a good time."
"For the cats, my lord?"
"Perhaps for the travellers as well." After which Mr. Fogg quietly continued his dinner. Fix had gone on shore shortly after Fogg, and his first destination was the headquarters of the Bombay police. He made himself known as a London detective, told his business at Bombay and the position of affairs relative to the supposed robber, and nervously asked if a warrant had arrived from London. It hadn't reached the office. Indeed, there had not yet been time for it to arrive. Fix was sorely disappointed, and tried to obtain an order of arrest from the director of Bombay Police. The director refused this, as the matter concerned the London office, which alone could legally deliver the warrant. Fix didn't insist, and was fain to resign himself to await the arrival of such an important document, but he was determined not to lose sight of the mysterious rogue for as long as he stayed in Bombay. He didn't doubt for a moment, any more than Passepartout, that Phileas Fogg would remain there, at least until it was time for the warrant to arrive. Passepartout, however, had no sooner heard his master's orders on leaving the Mongolia than he saw at once that they were to leave Bombay as they had done Suez and Paris, and that the journey would be extended to at least as far as Calcutta, and perhaps beyond even that place. He began to ask himself if this bet that Mr. Fogg talked about was not really in good earnest, and whether his fate was not in truth forcing him, despite his love of repose, around the world in 80 days. Having purchased the usual quota of shirts and shoes, he took a leisurely promenade about the streets, where crowds of people of many nationalities, Europeans, Persians with pointed caps, Banyas with round turbans, Sindhis with square bonnets, Parsees with black mitres, and long-robed Armenians were collected. It happened to be a day of a Parsee festival. These descendants of the sect of Zoroaster, the most thrifty, civilized, and intelligent and austere of the East Indians, among whom are counted the richest native merchants of Bombay, were celebrating a sort of religious carnival, with processions and shows, in the midst of which Indian dancing girls, clothed in rose-colored gauze, looped up with gold and silver, danced airily but with perfect modesty to the sound of the viols and the clanging of tambourines. It's needless to say that Passepartout watched these curious ceremonies with staring eyes and gaping mouth, and that his countenance was that of the greenest tourist imaginable. Unhappily for his master, as well as himself, his curiosity drew himself unconsciously farther off than he intended to go. At last, having seen the Parsee carnival wind away in the distance, he was turning his steps toward the station, when he happened to espy the splendid pagoda on Malabar Hill, and was seized with an irresistible desire to see its interior. He was quite ignorant that it's forbidden to Christians to enter certain Indian temples, and that even the faithful must not go in without leaving their shoes outside the door. It may be said here that a wise policy of the British government severely punishes a disregard of the practices of the native religions. Passepartout, however, thinking no harm, went in like a simple tourist, and was soon lost in admiration of the splendid Brahmin ornamentation, which everywhere met his eyes, when all of a sudden he found himself sprawling on the sacred flagging. He looked up to see 3 enraged priests, who forthwith fell upon him, tore off his shoes, and began to beat him with loud, savage exclamations. The agile Frenchman was soon upon his feet again, and lost no time in knocking down 2 of his long-gowned adversaries with his fists and a vigorous application of his toes. And then rushing out of the pagoda, as fast as his legs would carry him, he soon escaped the 3rd priest by mingling with the crowd in the streets. At 5 minutes before 8, Passepartout, hatless, shoeless, and having in the squabble lost his package of shirts and shoes, rushed breathlessly into the station. Fix, who had followed Mr. Fogg to the station and saw that he really was going to leave Bombay, was there upon the platform. He'd resolved to follow the supposed robber to Calcutta, and farther if necessary. Passepartout didn't observe the detective, who stood in an obscure corner, but Fix heard him relate his adventures in a few words to Mr. Fogg. "I hope that this will not happen again," said Phileas Fogg coldly as he got into the train. Poor Passepartout, quite crestfallen, followed his master without a word. Fix was on the point of entering another carriage when an idea struck him, which induced him to alter his plan. "No, I'll stay. An offense has been committed on Indian soil. I've got my man." And just then the locomotive gave a sharp screech, and the train passed out into the darkness of the night. Chapter 11, in which Phileas Fogg secures a curious means of conveyance at a fabulous price. The train had started punctually. Among the passengers were a number of officers, government officials, and opium and indigo merchants, whose business called them to the eastern coast. Passepartout rode in the same carriage with his master, and a 3rd passenger occupied a seat opposite to them. This was Sir Francis Cromarty, one of Mr. Fogg's whist partners on the Mongolia, now on his way to join the corps at Benares. Sir Francis was a tall, fair man of 50, who had greatly distinguished himself in the last Sepoy revolt. He had made India his home, only paying brief visits to England at rare intervals, and was almost as familiar as a native with the customs, history, and character of India and its people. But Phileas Fogg, who was not travelling, but only describing a circumference, took no pains to inquire into these subjects. He was a solid body, traversing an orbit around the terrestrial globe, according to the laws of rational mechanics. He was at this moment calculating in his mind the number of hours spent since his departure from London, and had it been in his nature to make a useless demonstration, would have rubbed his hands for satisfaction. Sir Francis Cromarty had observed the oddity of his travelling companion, although the only opportunity he had for studying him had been while he was dealing the cards and between 2 rubbers, and questioned himself whether a human heart really beat beneath this cold exterior, and whether Phileas Fogg had any sense of the beauties of nature. The Brigadier General was free to mentally confess that of all the eccentric persons he'd ever met, none was comparable to the product of this exact sciences. Phileas Fogg had not concealed from Sir Francis the design of his going around the world, nor the circumstances under which he set out, and the General only saw in the wager a useless eccentricity and a lack of sound common sense. In this way the strange gentleman was going on, but he would leave the world without having done any good to himself or anybody else. An hour after leaving Bombay, the train had passed into the viaducts in the island of Salsette, and had got into the open country. At Kye&I, they reached the junction of the branch line, which descends towards southeastern India by Kandala and Poona, and passing Palvel, they entered the defiles of the mountains, and with their basalt bases, and their summits crowned with thick and verdant forests. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty exchanged a few words from time to time, and now Sir Francis, reviving the conversation, observed, "Some years ago—" Wait, no. This is like a young, brigadier. "Some years ago, Mr. Fogg, you would have met with a delay at this point, which probably would have lost you your wager." "How so, Sir Francis?" "Because the railway stopped at the base of these mountains, which the passengers were obliged to cross in palanquins or ponies to Kandala on the other side." "Such a delay would not have deranged my plans in the least. I have constantly foreseen the likelihood of certain obstacles." "But, Mr. Fogg, you run the risk of
having some difficulty about this worthy fellow's adventure at the pagoda."
Passepartout, his feet comfortably wrapped in his traveling blanket, was sound asleep and didn't dream that anybody was talking about him.
"The government is very severe upon that kind of offense. It takes particular care that the religious customs of the locals should be respected, and if your servant were caught, well—"
"Very well, Sir Francis. If he had been caught, he would have been condemned and punished, and then would have quietly returned to Europe. I don't see how this affair could have delayed his master." And the conversation fell again. During the night the train left the mountains behind and passed Nasik, and the next day proceeded over the flat, well-cultivated country of the Khandeish, with straggling villages, above which rose the minarets of the pagodas. This fertile territory is watered by numerous small rivers and limpid streams, mostly tributaries of the Godavari. One moment. Passepartout, on waking and looking out, couldn't realize that he was actually crossing India in a railway train. The locomotive, guided by an English engineer and fed with English coal, threw out its smoke upon cotton, coffee, nutmeg, clove, and pepper plantations, while the steam curled in spirals around groups of palm trees, in the midst of which were seen picturesque bungalows, viharis, and marvelous temples, enriched by the exhaustless ornamentation of Indian architecture. Then they came upon vast tracts extending to the horizon, with jungles inhabited by snakes and tigers, which fled at the noise of the train, succeeded by forests penetrated by the railway, and still haunted by elephants, which, with pensive eyes, gazed at the train as it passed. The travellers crossed, beyond Milligaume, the fatal country so often stained with blood by the secretaries of the goddess Kali. Not far off rose Elora, with its graceful pagodas, and the famous Aurangabad, capital of the ferocious Aurangzeb, now the chief town of one of the detached provinces of the kingdom of the Nizam. It was thereabouts that Faringha, the Thuggee chief, king of the stranglers, held his sway. These ruffians, united by a secret bond, strangled victims of every age in honor of the goddess Death, without ever shedding blood. There was a period when this part of the country could scarcely be travelled over without finding corpses in every direction. The English government has succeeded in greatly diminishing the murders, though they still exist and pursue the exercise of their terrible rights. At 12:30, the train stopped at Burhampur, where Passepartout was able to purchase some Indian slippers, ornamented with false pearls, in which, with evident vanity, he proceeded to encase his feet. The travellers made a hasty breakfast and started off for Singapore, after skirting for a little while the banks of the small river Tapti, which empties into the Gulf of Cambrai near Surat. Passepartout was now plunged into absorbing reverie. Up to his arrival at Bombay, he had entertained hopes that their journey would end there, but now that they were plainly whirling across India at full speed, a sudden change had come over the spirit of his dreams. His old vagabond nature returned to him. The fantastic ideas of his youth once more took possession of him. He came to regard his master's project as intended in good earnest, believed in the reality of the bet, and therefore in the tour of the world and the necessity of making it without fail within the designated period. Already he began to worry about possible delays and accidents which might happen on the way. He recognized himself as being personally interested in the wager, and trembled by the thought that he might have been the means of losing it by his unpardonable folly of the night before. Being much less cool-headed than Mr. Fogg, he was much more restless, counting and recounting the days passed over, uttering maledictions when the train stopped, and accusing it of sluggishness, and mentally blaming Mr. Fogg for not having bribed the engineer. The worthy fellow was ignorant that, while it was possible by such means to hasten the rate of a steamer, it could not be done on the railway. The train entered the defiles of the Sutpur Mountains, which separate the Calendish from Belkund, towards evening. The next day Sir Francis Cromarty asked Passepartout which time it was, to which, on consulting his watch, he replied that it was 3 a.m. The famous timepiece, always regulated on the Greenwich meridian, which was now some 77 degrees westward, was now at least 4 hours slow. Sir Francis corrected Passepartout's time, whereupon the latter made the same remark that he'd done to fix, and upon the general insisting that the watch should be regulated in each new meridian, that since he was constantly going eastward, that is, in the face of the sun, and therefore the days were shorter by 4 minutes for each degree gone over, Passepartout obstinately refused to alter his watch, which he kept at London time. It was an innocent delusion which harmed no one. The train stopped at 8 o'clock in the midst of a glade some 15 miles beyond Rothal, where there were several bungalows and workmen's cabins. The conductor, passing along the carriages, shouted, "Passengers will get out here." Phileas Fogg looked at Sir Francis Cromarty for an explanation, but the general couldn't tell what meant a halt in the midst of this forest of dates and acacias. Passepartout, not less surprised, rushed out and speedily returned, crying, "Monsieur, no more railway." "Oh, what do you mean?" "I mean to say that the train isn't going on." The general at once stepped out, while Phileas Fogg calmly followed him, and they proceeded together to Conductor. "Where are we?"
"At the hamlet of Colby."
"Do we stop here?"
"Certainly. The railway isn't finished."
"What? Not finished?"
"No, there's a matter of 50 miles to be laid from here to Albahad, where the line begins again."
"But the papers announced the opening of the railway throughout."
"What would you have, officer? The papers were mistaken."
"You just stole tickets from Bombay to Calcutta," retorted Sir Francis, who was growing warm.
"No doubt, but the passengers know that they must provide means of transportation for themselves from Colby to Albahad."
Sir Francis was furious at this, and Passepartout would willingly have knocked the conductor down, and didn't dare to look at his master. "Sir Francis," said Mr. Fogg quietly, "we will, if you please, look about for some means of conveyance to Albahad." "Mr. Fogg, this is a delay greatly to your disadvantage." "No, Sir Francis, it was foreseen." "What? You knew that the way—" "Not at all, but I knew that some obstacle or another would sooner or later arise on my route. Nothing, therefore, is lost. I have 2 days, which I have already gained, to sacrifice. A steamer leaves Calcutta for Hong Kong at noon on the 25th. This is the 22nd, and we shall reach Calcutta in time." There was nothing to say to so confident a response. It was but too true that the railway came to a termination at this point. The papers were like some watches which have a way of getting too fast, and had been premature in their announcement of the completion of the line. The greater part of the travellers were aware of this interruption, and, leaving the train, they began to engage such vehicles as the village could provide: four-wheeled palki-garis, wagons drawn by zebus, carriages that looked like perambulating pagodas, palanquins, ponies, and what not. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty, after searching the village from end to end, came back without having found anything. "Well, I shall go afoot, then," said Fogg, and Passepartout, who had now rejoined his master, made a wry grimace as he thought of his magnificent but too frail Indian shoes. Happily, he too had been looking about him, and after a moment's hesitation, he said, "Monsieur, I think I have found a means of conveyance." "What?" "An elephant. An elephant that belongs to an Indian who lives but 100 steps from here." "Let us go and see the elephant." They soon reached a small hut, near which, enclosed with some high palings, was the animal in question. An Indian came out of the hut, and, at their request, conducted them within the enclosure. The elephant, for which its owner had reared, not for a beast of burden, but for warlike purposes, was half domesticated. The Indian had begun already, by often irritating him and feeding him every 3 months on sugar and butter, to impart him a ferocity not in his nature, this method being often employed by those who train the elephants for battle. Happily, however, for Mr. Fogg, the animal's instruction in this direction had not gone far, and the elephant still preserved his natural gentleness. Kye&I, this was the name of the beast, could doubtless travel rapidly for a long time, and in default of any other means of conveyance, Mr. Fogg resolved to hire him. But elephants are far from cheap in India, where they're becoming scarce. The males, which alone are suitable for circus shows, are much sought after, especially as but few of them are domesticated. When therefore Mr. Fogg proposed to the Indian to hire Kye&I, he refused point blank. Mr. Fogg persisted, offering the excessive sum of £10 an hour for the loan of the beast to Albahad. He was refused. £20, still refused. £40, he was still refused. Passepartout jumped at each advance, but the Indian declined to be tempted. Yet the offer was an alluring one, for supposing it took the elephant 15 hours to reach Albahad, his owner would receive no less than £600 sterling. Phileas Fogg, without getting in the least flurried, proposed to purchase the animal outright, and at first offered £1,000 for him. The Indian, perhaps thinking he was going to make a great bargain, still refused. Sir Francis Cromarty took Fogg aside and begged him to reflect before he went any further. To which that gentleman replied he was not in the habit of acting rashly, that a bet of £20,000 was at stake, that the elephant was absolutely necessary to him, and that he would secure him if he had to pay 20 times its value. Returning to the Indian, whose small eyes were glistening with avarice, betrayed that with him it was only a question of how great a price he could obtain. Mr. Fogg first offered £1,200, then £1,500, £1,800, then £2,000. Passepartout, usually so rubicund, was fairly white with suspense, and at £2,000 finally the man yielded. "What a price, good heavens, for an elephant!" It only remained now to find a guide, which was comparatively easy. A young Parsee with an intelligent face offered his services, to which Mr. Fogg accepted, promising so generous a reward as to materially stimulate his zeal. The elephant was led out and equipped, and the Parsee, who was an accomplished elephant driver, covered his back with a sort of saddle-cloth, and attached to each of his flanks some curiously uncomfortable howdahs. Phileas Fogg paid the Indian with some banknotes which he extracted from the famous carpet-bag, a proceeding that seemed to deprive poor Passepartout of his vitals. Then he offered to carry Sir Francis to Albahad, which the brigadier gratefully accepted, as one traveller the more would not be likely to fatigue the gigantic beast. Provisions were purchased at Colby, and while Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg took the howdahs on either side, Passepartout got astride the saddle-cloth between them. The Parsee perched himself on the elephant's neck, and at 9 o'clock they set out from the village, the animal marching off through the dense forest of palms by the shortest cut. Alright, y'all. That's it for this evening. Come back next week for chapter 12. And we'll, continue our journey around the world in 80 days. What was I going to say? If you're new around here, welcome. This has been Paper Cuts. This is my, what I would like to call my premiere show, where I read public domain novels. And I think that's, something that it's a niche that I have not yet seen filled. And I have a great time reading to you all. And, let's see. Anyway, that's it for the recording this week. Come back next week for more. This has been Paper Cuts. I hope it didn't sting.